Hello and welcome to the Ravens Brawl podcast, a part of the Brawl Network. We're in better spirits this week after having to do a very somber recap show last week after that debacle that was the Ravens-Titans playoff game. I'm your host, Dave Stomlittle. Pleased to be joined by my co-host, Joe Schiller. Joe, you're in better spirits this week, I hope?
Yeah, it's crazy what a week does, but we had our venting session last week, our therapy session, so it's all off season right now.
Yes, it is. And we are excited. We have a great guest for you guys to listen to today. We'll get to him in a brief moment. We got to talk about our sponsor. We got to pay the bills here on the Ravens Brawl podcast. We got to talk about thebearsbrawl.com/fanatics. Great website, great deals on all sorts of sports gear. You want to look good, you want to have the newest stuff in stock. That's the place to go. Thebearsbrawl.com/fanatics. Go there, support those guys. They support us. So it all works in the end. So, Joe, I turn it over to you.
Yep, we have a great guest on this week. It's Brian McFarland. You can find him on Twitter at Ravens Salary Cap. He pretty much, that handle kind of encompasses exactly what he does. He handles a lot of salary cap stuff for the Ravens. He's kind of go-to guy. And as we've gone into the offseason now, we figured we'd have him on. Brian, first of all, it's great to have you on. And first, the question I wanted to ask you was, and I kind of wanted this, and I think some other people too, is how exactly did you get into all this salary cap stuff and doing what you do?
Well, it actually started going all the way back to 2002 when the Ravens had their major purge and had to cut guys, cut everybody basically. After the Super Bowl, after the Super Bowl in 2000, they loaded up for 2001 to try and repeat, get Modell another championship, and they restructured every deal. As it turns out, they restructured every deal they had to create cap space, and then all of a sudden they cut everybody. And to be perfectly honest with you, the Baltimore Sun didn't do a very good job of explaining why and what the salary cap was. And we in Baltimore were like 5 years in, 6 years in at that point. And for those of us who remember the Colts, there was no such thing as a salary cap back then. So there wasn't a whole lot of explanation or understanding. So I just started digging into it, and then I, at that point, I started writing on message boards and, doing updates on message boards. And Tony Lombardi came along and brought me on to Ravens 24/7. I think it was about 2006. And that's now Russell Street Report, and been there ever since.
Awesome. Well, like I said, we're super excited to have you on. And I know you just recently released kind of your overview of what the cap is looking like going into the offseason right now. For anyone that's listening right now, I was wondering if you could just give like a basic overview of kind of what the Ravens are heading into the offseason as far as kind of cap space and flexibility.
Sure. I mean, they're in the best shape they've been in years. At the moment, and it's going to go down, but at the moment they have $29 million. That will go down to probably about $23 million. Right now, that $29 million only counts the 50 players that are presently under contract. They have to tender their restricted free agents and exclusive rights free agents. That'll get them up above get them to about 55 probably, and that will reduce it down to about that 23 million. The cap goes up. The cap's gone up. So they haven't made, that would be before they've made any moves, and they've been able to get to 23 million in past years, but that's after they made cuts and things like that. So there's certainly some of those that can come along to create some more space. One thing I've been trying to point out to people on Twitter is that they've done a lot of their work already. They re-signed Marcus Peters. They extended Willie Snead, L.J. Fort, Patrick Ricard. I mean, they extended all those guys during the season, and even last spring, they signed Tucker to an extension, Yonda to an extension, and those extensions, those are all guys that would have been free agents this coming March. So they kind of got a lot of their 2002 work, or sorry, I'm sorry, 2020 work done in 2019. So while they could, if they didn't do that, they'd have 50 million in cap space, but they'd have a lot more work to do. So they've gotten a lot of their work done already. They still got a lot of work to do. They do have a lot of free agents, especially on the defensive side of the ball. So that's there's definitely some things they're going to need to do.
I always find it interesting when we talk about cap flexibility because when we look at a lot of teams who have cap space, and some of the top teams have between 80 and sometimes $100 million in cap space, and for the Ravens this flexibility is around 29 million. I feel like as fans, especially you see it on Twitter, get so like entrenched in just wanting to sign every single free agent, and it's just a common thing when a guy either gets released or heads into free agency. Our first fit is, how are the Ravens going to sign them? How are we going to get them into Baltimore? But that's not typically how the Ravens usually operate, as far as they do when Ozzie Newsome was general manager and now Eric DeCosta. I know it's only been one season with Eric DeCosta under the helm, but have you seen anything different as far as how he operates under the cap space than Ozzie Newsome in recent years?
Well, I mean, the more cap space you have, the more or the easier you can structure contracts. When they've been tight against the cap, they've had to honestly use pretty poor structures because they needed to lessen that first or second year cap number, and that became bloated cap numbers on the back end, and that can become a problem. More recently, they've been able to do a flatter structure, which spreads that money out pretty evenly. So your first year cap number's higher, but that means that you might not have the dead money at the end of the deal if the player gets hurt and you have to cut him, or he just underperforms and you have to cut him. So that's not necessarily Ozzie versus DeCosta, but that is something that had already started happening under Ozzie. I think the biggest thing under DeCosta, though, is, as I just mentioned, all of these extensions ahead of time. Ozzie was one who didn't seem to, I know they tried at times, but didn't seem to be one to get guys done early. And DeCosta made it very clear from the beginning that was one of his goals, because if you get a guy early before he truly blossoms, I guess we'll say, you can get a decent deal on him, at least for the first couple of years. Then you're going to probably have to extend him and pay him more, because that's the going rate. But so that's certainly, I think that's the biggest difference so far. All of these extensions we've seen, we might not have seen those, which means these guys are going to hit the market. And when guys hit the market, as we've seen in the past, we usually have a number, and the market goes nuts, and then we let these guys walk. So I think that's the biggest, and I think that's good cap management too. Nothing certainly against Ozzie, but Ozzie was a former player too, and he sort of had this, go hit the market, get what you deserve. And if I think we can afford that, we'll pay that, we'll match it. If not, go get what you deserve. And so I think it's a different philosophy that way with DeCosta.
Brian, I would agree totally with that. And I love the signing guys early because, like you said, you get to set the price on them. You're not necessarily letting other teams or the free agent market set that. My question, where do the Ravens stand with dead money this year? Because that usually seems to be something that's hindered the Ravens in the past.
Well, yeah, I mean, dead money is honestly, I think fans to an extent make it out worse than it actually is, because it's the cost of doing business. You sign guys to contracts, it's money that's already spent, and at some point you have to pay it. Right now, and obviously they haven't made any cuts, but right now it's only $1,300. But I mean, we'll probably get into this a little more, but Tony Jefferson is probably likely to get cut. They're $7 million. So it's just I've always been, like I said, fans get a little more worked up about it than I do generally, but it's the cost of doing business. You're going to sign guys, and sometimes they're not going to work out, or sometimes they get to the end of the contract. They're going to retire before the contract is up, and there's going to be some dead money. Obviously, last year there was a decent amount. A couple years prior, last year was big because of Flacco and the $16 million in dead money. But the couple years prior, they'd been about league average. Going maybe 4 or 5 years back, it was pretty bad. That was when they were generally in the top 5 in the league. But this year, even with other than Jefferson, maybe Carr, they shouldn't have a whole lot of dead money unless something really, surprising comes along.
I think I have the Ravens dead money sitting in like my savings account right now. It's good to see that they have just a lot of don't have that much dead money right now. I want to transition a little bit to what you mentioned was Tony Jefferson and some potential cap casualties coming up this offseason. I don't know if it's this year. I haven't maybe done as much of a deep dive into it, but I don't know if there's as many obvious cap casualties as there might have been in past off seasons. But I know Tony Jefferson has been one. I know James Hurst has been mentioned as another potential cap casualty. Do you see any other players that fans should be looking for to potentially be cut this offseason?
No, those are the two. The two, and I would throw Brandon Carr in there as well, perhaps. So those are the three that I guess are the most obvious, or obvious may not be the fair word, but I mean, I think it's pretty fair to say that Jefferson is gone. The 7 million, when you're looking to create cap space, you want to find the guys you can create the most cap space with the easiest. You don't want to cut 10 guys to make $7 million. You want to cut one guy who creates 7 million. So Jefferson at 7 million is the big one, certainly. Carr would be 6 million. Hurst would only be 2.75 million. So now if Marshall Yonder retires, obviously he's not getting cut, but if he retires, that's 7 million. So that's I think everybody on the team and every fan would prefer to keep that money on his in his salary and have him return. But so those are the only obvious ones, or the only ones. I mean, there's always seems to be a surprise here or there, but I mean, to be honest with you, they have a much younger roster than they've had in the past, so they don't have as many aging, underperforming veterans like they've always seemed to have, with perhaps bloated cap figures. So, like I said, Jefferson, with the way Chuck Clark seemed to take the helm of the defense and take the green dot and really thrive, and seem to get the players in where they were supposed to be, which seemed to be a problem prior to that. I don't think there's any question Jefferson's gone. Carr will probably depend on if they draft a corner, or if Jimmy Smith retires. He's a free agent. I'm sorry, if he resigns, because he's a free agent. And they could also, with Carr, I could very possibly see them going and asking him to take a pay cut. His 6 million in salary and bonus is kind of high for a guy that's probably at this point probably your sixth D back. I mean, not sixth corner, but since he's playing safety, I mean, he's behind all the starters. He'll be behind Tavon Young, so he's probably the sixth guy at this point. So 6 million is a lot for that. So maybe they knock that down to 3 and give him incentives to make some of it back if he plays a lot or gets interceptions, things like that. So, but those are pretty much the only guys. Hurst, I'm not sure about Hurst. Hurst seems to me to be a guy that will likely be on the team until cut downs. And if somebody beats him out, because right now they don't have any swing tackle, they don't have a backup offensive tackle. Now, if they draft a guy, if they draft an offensive tackle in the 4th round, then you could see Hurst go then. But his cap number's only 5.25 million, so it's not the end of the world there. And again, there's only about 2.75 million in savings. So I could see him hanging around. But if they have some grand plan that they need that cap space for, then he's gone. And obviously, if they have to use the franchise tag on, if they decide, I should say, use the franchise tag on Judon, then they may need that space to do other things.
All right, so Brian, just for my curiosity's sake, not that I think that any of the guys you mentioned could stay, is there any way that they would restructure these contracts potentially to keep them on the roster, or is this just way easier for them to cut them?
Well, I think the only first to really restructure, Carr would be the only one, and that wouldn't be a restructure per se, it would be a pay cut. Jefferson, I just don't think there's a place for him anymore. And he's still young enough, he can go out and make decent money, so he's not taking less money. I don't see why you would extend any of them either. Carr's older. Again, there's just really no place for Jefferson now, and I don't know that you want to make Hurst's contract, and I shouldn't say worse, but I don't know if you want to extend him longer when you're looking at the possibility of replacing him sooner rather than later, in the next maybe year or two. So, and they're generally you're restructuring contracts to create cap space. And right now, unless they have some grand plan, I doubt they will restructure, because restructures are one of the reasons you get yourself into cap hell. Unless they're going to go out, unless they're going to franchise Jude and then go out and sign, a top of the market another top of the market pass rusher, then I can't imagine them restructuring to create cap space and when you restructure, you're creating cap space this year by pushing cap space into the future and taking it away in the future. Now, with the new CBA, maybe that's not a bad move, because the cap should go up substantially over the first couple of years of the new CBA, but I'm not sure you want to make that decision yet until you know exactly what the new CBA is going to do.
So the Ravens have some interesting free agent decisions for a team that went 14-2, especially on the defensive side of the ball. We could do a whole podcast, going through every guy that's going to hit the free agent market. But some of the guys, three guys in particular I wanted to key in on are who you mentioned already: Matthew Judon, Jimmy Smith, and also Michael Pierce. To talk about the franchise tag for Matthew Judon seems like more of a possibility every day, since they haven't been able to sign him to a long-term deal yet. In your opinion, if you're the Ravens, is that the preferred way to go? Obviously, you want to sign him to a long-term deal if the two sides can come to an agreement. But if not, if you're the Ravens, do you let Matthew Judon walk, or are you going to slap a franchise tag on him with the possibility that he doesn't stay past the 2020 season?
Yeah, I mean, he clearly seems like, and obviously when we saw what happened with Zadarius Smith last year, and I don't think anybody thought he was going to get 17+ million a year, and then, the market went crazy, and I imagine, and there were reports that the Ravens had talked to Judon about an extension, but my guess is they were in the $14 or $15 million a year range, and then out of nowhere, Zadarius gets 17, and that kind of blew them out of the water. So, it sounds like they do want him back. I know Harbaugh said it's going to be hard. The question is, what are their other plans? What are they looking at elsewhere? And are they willing to, the tag for him is going to be between 16 and 18 million. So that takes pretty much wipes your cap space out, or most of it out. So that's something that, they're going to have to make a decision on, and that may mean they cut some guys, or maybe they restructure a deal in order to do that. In order to create the cap space, they need to do other things if they've got to lock that much into them. Usually guys that get franchised, you end up re-signing, but that usually doesn't happen until, until June or July. And that means that cap space is tied up until then. There's another wrinkle, and that is we don't have, this is the last year of the present CBA, and who knows what's going to happen under the new one. Everybody expects it to go up, how much it's going to go up, things like that. So there are probably a lot of players that may not. So in that case, Judon may be happy. Just you put the tag on him. He's like, fine, I'll play for the tag. I'll cash in on 16 to 18 million, and next year I'll have a better idea of what what teams are going to be willing to pay, because we'll know what the new CBA, what the new numbers are. So where the cap goes. It's probably going to be 200 million this year. It goes up about 10 to 11 each year, but we'll see. With under the new CBA, maybe it goes up 15 to 16 or something like that. So, so that's something that we'll have to. That's a little wrinkle there, that perhaps, they do it with the hope of getting him re-signed, and then out of nowhere, he's like, no, I'll just play for the tag, and that screws up the rest of their plan. So they got to be careful with that, but I'm sure between now and then they'll negotiate and get a feel for how close they may or may not be, and that may help them decide whether to go with the tag or not.
What about Jimmy Smith as well? He's been a guy that's been talked about. He's going to hit an unrestricted free agency, but we talked about it with Sarah Ellison last week. 2 weeks ago about how it seems they have such a good relationship between Jimmy and the team, and it seems like he could potentially take a lesser deal to come back. What's your opinion on that? Do you think he's a guy that the Ravens do eventually re-sign? I think having that veteran cornerback is huge for the defensive back group, even after they extended Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphrey's still there with Earl Thomas. But just your thoughts on just potentially Jimmy Smith returning.
Yeah, I mean, you'd certainly love to have that depth, and obviously putting four corners out there, is certainly, today's NFL, that's certainly a thing you can do. And he came pretty much straight out and said it in that one interview back in December that, he wanted to stay, and he even kind of laughed at himself, and he said, "I'm probably not doing myself any favors, but this is where I want to be." As far as negotiations go. So I don't know. I mean, my gut says that they won't offer him enough, and that he will go elsewhere because somebody's going to offer him more, and it's going to be likely his last contract. And that would be my guess. I mean, I personally would like to have him back. That injury history is, it is so worrisome because he just seems to get hurt so often. I mean, what kind of career could he have had if he wasn't hurt all the time? He might be talked about. I mean, I don't know if he ever made a Pro Bowl, but if he wasn't hurt all the time, he probably would have. But so I think they'll make him an offer. I think they like him, and he's made it clear he wants to stay. My gut feeling is that it won't be something that happened. If it doesn't happen before free agency, it's not going to happen. Because once he hits the market, there'll be enough. He'll get other offers, and he'll look at the difference between the money, and he'll say, "You know what? I'd love to stay in Baltimore, but my future security and these extra couple million here are what I need."
So, Brian, with the cap space where it is, where do you think, in terms of the tiers? You always hear this with the free agents: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Where do you think the Ravens will go after players in terms of if we're looking at talent in this free agent class?
Well, they're always good for a surprise, but usually they do not go. Usually they and obviously this is DaCosta, so we'll see. And certainly Earl Thomas was a bolt out of the blue last year. Nobody was expecting that, but we're usually not somebody that goes right out and hits the market hard. I think Jefferson and Thomas were probably the only two, first or second or third day, other than re-signing their own. So I think they'll make a concerted effort. The defensive line, they need a lot of reinforcement there. That to me is a sneaky one where all of a sudden, and I honestly haven't looked at the free agent list very other than our own, in much depth at this point. But that could be a sneaky one where they go out and, especially assuming we didn't really get to it, but I think Pierce is probably going to be too expensive given what they're paying Brandon Williams. So I could see them going and getting a veteran who's cheaper, but who can provide somewhat the same skill set. He's just not going to be 25 or 26 like Pierce is. So I don't envision. They always have that one sneaky signing, it seems, every year, but I think mostly it's going to be re-signing their own. Maybe it's a Pernell McPhee if he's healthy, bringing him back, and that may not happen for a while. A Jihad Ward, who actually played pretty well considering nobody knew who the heck he was when they signed him. So I think those kinds of guys. But and maybe a Justin Ellis, another, again, just for depth on the D line. And they might have a sneaky signing here and there. But I think, as they've always done, they'll look at the guys who've been cut so that they can, garner another, a comp pick or two. They love draft picks, obviously. But I think that's pretty much. They've got enough cap space, but the big question is Jude, because if they can get him re-signed, then he's not going to cost them this year $16 to $18 million. He's going to cost, 10 to 12, at least on the first year of the deal, probably. So that creates a lot more wiggle room where they can maybe go do another splash. If they have to use the franchise tag, then I think that takes away any possibility of a splash, unless there are some surprise cuts or things like that create extra cap space.
One guy who's not going to be an unrestricted free agent, but a restricted free agent this offseason is center Matt Skura, who the Ravens obviously lost in the Rams game to a pretty significant knee injury, and he talked to an extent about the severity of it after the season, and it sounds like an injury that he could possibly not be ready for by the start of next season. I think he believe he tore his ACL, MCL, PCL, and also dislocated his kneecap. I'm not a doctor, but that sounds just pretty brutal just in terms of football. But I know the restricted free agents are a little bit different as far as tenders that teams can put on the players. And you touched on a little bit when I was reading your salary cap overview. But if you don't mind just explaining a little bit about your philosophy of what you think the Ravens could do in that sense.
Sure. So Skura was an undrafted free agent. In the way there are different levels of tender. There's a first round tender, which if another team signs the player to a offer sheet and you have the right to match, but if you decline to match, you would get a first round pick. There's also a second round tender, and then the low tender is the draft pick is based on the round that you were drafted in. So if you're a fifth round pick, that's the compensation if the Ravens let you leave. But for undrafted free agents, therefore, there is no compensation. So the Ravens would have the right to match, but they would not. There's no compensation if they let the player go to the other team. Now, before the injury, I would have been certain that Skura would get the second round tender, because there was no way they would use that low tender on him, with the possibility of letting him get away without any compensation. And the compensation is what keeps teams away from making offers. So a second round made sense. I don't think anybody would have given up a second round pick for him. So that would secure him for the next year, and maybe they sign him to a long-term deal also. Now with the injury and given the timetable, as you just explained, my gut feeling says they will give him the low tender now, which stinks for him. But since he may not be ready, I don't think they run the risk of some other team signing him to an offer sheet, because nobody's going to offer him enough to make him want to sign an offer sheet when that team doesn't know what they're going to get for this year. Whereas, and for him, it's why would I sign a lesser deal? If somebody made a lesser offer, well, the Ravens could just match it because it's not that big. That's not a big deal. But why would he want to accept a lesser offer? And where that he would have, as of next year, been facing potentially a really nice deal as a free agent. So what he probably would do is say, you know what, I'll stay here. Hopefully I'm healthy. Hopefully I have a good year next year. Hopefully I'm good to go at the beginning of the year. I'm healthy, and then I'll hit the free agent market next year, showing that I'm healthy, and then I'll get my big deal. So I don't see where. So it's two parts. I don't see a team making him an offer, even at the low tender, and I don't see that him receiving an offer that's worth him taking and cutting himself short, so to speak, because that offer is going to reflect that he's hurt at this moment. Whereas and then he's locked up for a couple of years at a below market value, or what he deserves. So that's my sense of it. Now, the Ravens sometimes have always, it's only about $1 million difference between the two tenders, and they might say, well, we'll show you, we'll throw you a bone, so to speak. So when we talk about contract negotiations next year, remember that. So, and maybe that'll get them, get a better deal from him at that point. So, I mean, they've always been a player friendly, for the most part, a player friendly team. So, that they could do that and say, well, we would have given you the second, so we're going to give it to you anyway. But my guess is it's the low tender this time.
All right, Brian, as we get closer to free agency, what is the biggest misconception about cap space, cap room that you want to tell people to not fall for as we get ready to roll into the offseason?
Well, there's two part. I guess the main thing is that during the off season, an NFL roster can total up to 90 players. You obviously cannot keep all 90 under the cap, so there's this thing called the rule of 51. And I have no idea why they decided on 51 and not 53, because the 53 is the regular season roster. But that means basically the 51 top cap numbers on the team count against the cap during the off season. That means, and I write an article every August about this. That means when August comes along and you get to cut downs, then after cut downs, everybody counts. So that means the 53. So you go from 51 to 53 right there. And then your practice squad players, your players on IR, your players on PUP, they all count against the cap. So you can't go into August having $5 million in cap space, because it's probably going to take $5 million at that point, from when you have to basically expand the cap, when those players are all added to the cap. And then, of course, you have to have money to carry into the season, because injuries happen and you have to sign people. So, people, it seems like, this time of year, we can spend all the way to the cap, and we'll be fine. Well, there's so many other things that come in along, and obviously you got to sign your rookies, which is another issue. But the main one is the rule of 51 gives a bit of I'm trying to think of the right word for it, but it gives you a false sense of security, I guess, as far as the cap space goes, because there's basically the cap space they have, and the cap space, and then there's another number, which is the cap space they can spend, and those are two totally different numbers.
One last question I had for you before we wrap up is, we talked about how Eric DeCosta has done a good job about locking up talent for the future before they hit free agency. There are a couple guys in particular that could still get some deals potentially this offseason or next offseason. I look at Ronnie Stanley and potentially Marlon Humphrey. Are those two of those guys potentially candidates for cap extensions this offseason, or do you see it, holding off with the Ravens' current cap space?
Well, Stanley's the more and Stanley works for two reasons. One, he's a free agent next year.
Right.
They still have Marlon for 2 more years, for this year and the following year. So they have some time, a little bit of time there. So Stanley is playing under the fifth year option, which is basically gives the first round pick a big jump in the 5th year of the contract. And that jump is up to, for him, almost 13 million, 12.8 million. So he is a prime candidate. One, because he played very well this year, and two, you can lower that $12 million cap number by a bit to create a little cap space, and more importantly, getting him locked up long term is the key there. They did that with Jimmy Smith at this time. When he was coming into his 5th year, and I guess he was probably they did not get it done with Mosley, and they certainly didn't want to get it done with Brashard Perryman. But so that's something I'm sure they're going to work on. That seems to be, we've gone through how many left tackles since Ogden, so that seems like something that's a no-brainer, because it gives him a little cap relief and again gets him locked up. Humphrey's an interesting case, because they could wait another year, and as I mentioned earlier, Humphrey may want to wait another year himself, because he may think, let's see what I can play it out one more year, because that new CBA hits, and I'm gonna, I can really cash in then, and if I do it now, I'm kind of I might be selling myself short. So he's certainly a candidate, and they just gave Peters the big deal. So, you could see Humphrey saying, well, I've been on the team. You drafted me. I've been on the team longer than him, so it's my turn. And I can't make an argument against that either. So, that's an extension, but that will cost them money. He's got a low cap number on his rookie deal, so that's going to cost them money. And then certainly on the horizon, you have Lamar Jackson. And if he has another year, I'm not saying he's going to have another MVP year next year, but if he has if he's 75% of what he was this year, I'll just throw that out, then he's going to basically demand and command an extension. quarterbacks are, now seems to be the good quarterbacks. Your Wentz's, your Goffs, they got contracts after their third year. It certainly looks like Mahomes is going to get his. Watson's going to get his, both after their third year, and they're going to get them this spring at some point. So while it's nice to say we have Lamar under control for 5 years on a rookie deal, the reality is, and maybe this is one of those other things that fans don't always understand about the cap. It's not how the cap works, but it's how, the precedents are there that Lamar is most likely going to get his extension next year.
All right, so Brian, my final question. Put your fandom hat on. I know you haven't probably looked at the whole list of free agents yet, but who's the one guy that's a free agent that you'd like to see the Ravens sign?
Well, I mean, a lot of it, obviously depends on Judon, but Yannick, I always have trouble pronouncing his last name.
Ngakoue,
thank you. I mean, he would be. Because he's more of a pure pass rusher than Judon. Although their stats aren't that terribly dissimilar, but I think he commands more attention from the offensive line and double teams and things like that. So I would say, and I don't know that Jacksonville is going to let him out of town. It seems to me they'll franchise him. Although there was some rumors today I saw somewhere that I guess he posted something cryptic about free. I think it was free. It just said free. I don't know what that means, or maybe that's his hope. But so that would be the guy, especially if they let Judon walk. I mean, you got to decide what would be a better money spent, and that they would have to sign him. They'd have to compete for him in the first, as well. So that could take him up to $20 million a year. Who knows? So. And is he that much better of a player than Judon? So that's something they would have to decide. I mean, he's the one, and like I said, I haven't really looked at the list too much. Wide receiver, a veteran wide receiver, big guy, a taller, not jump ball, because I hate using that term, but just a guy who, can really fight for the contested catches would be great, especially with Lamar not being the most accurate guy in the world. But I just question how many guys are going to come here when the guys that are catching 80, 90, 100 balls, are they going to come here and catch 45? I mean, for whatever reason, wide receivers seem to be the position that the most egos seem to collect in. And I just question whether that's something. So it seems to me that might have to come through the draft. And then add a rookie to the 2 second-year guys and to Snead, and maybe Jaleel Scott, flashes and really makes starts making a name for himself. But I think that's why they re-signed Snead when they did. They knew they needed to get a guy, make sure they had a guy like that. And since he was here and happy, then it was easier to get him than to bring somebody in who's looking at the offense and wondering where's my place in this. And especially for a guy that might get another contract down the road, you're going to sign for 3 or 4 years here, catch 40, 50 balls, and then hit free agency, and teams are going to be like, well, this guy only caught 40, 50 balls. I know they look at it in more depth than that, but I think that's so. I haven't looked at the defensive tackles. That wouldn't shock me. And obviously, if Yonder retires, it could certainly be an interior offensive lineman, especially if Skura doesn't look like he's coming back. So as far as a name, I can't put names on those, but again, I think what they're going to do, you're going to see them re-signing some of their guys, and maybe they have one splash, and that splash may be Judon, or if he's gone, then they've got plenty of room to make a splash.
Keep an eye on Gerald McCoy. You're talking about interior defensive lineman. He's a free agent, and I've heard Carolina's doing a whole clean house on that defense. They want to start fresh, so he'd be a guy I think would be a nice upgrade over Michael Pierce.
Yeah, he was clearly a guy that they were very interested in last spring when Tampa released him. So that's a good call. I think that, and I think he would provide, that element that the interior has not had for a long time. That inside pass rush other than, moving, people around to create it. But the guy that can create it all by himself, and I think he and Williams next to each other would make certainly a good complement to each other. So that's a good call.
All right, Joe, I'm out of questions. How about you?
No, I think I am too. Brian, it's great having you on. Some great insight. We appreciate it.
No, thank you. Anytime.
We'd love that. We'll have to have you back on again, Brian, to chat some more about the salary cap, because it's such a fascinating topic that, as you said, and we kind of know, there are people that don't really understand the salary cap. So it's great we have people like you that help us understand it on a day-to-day basis. All right, and with that, we are going to wrap up this edition of the Ravens Brawl podcast. We will be back next week. Joe, who's our guest next week?
We're going to have on Bobby Trossett from WBAL, his first season covering the Ravens for WBAL, so it should be good. We're going to keep the offseason rolling with some great guests.
All right. Brian, once again, thank you for coming on. We had a lot of fun.
Me too. Thanks, gentlemen.
And for Joe Schiller, I'm Dave Steinwettle. So long. Have a great week. If you watched a Pro Bowl, you're a better person than I am. We'll talk to you next week.